All right, now part of what I'm going to present for you today is somewhat a little bit of history and so on of the most recent iteration of the CSWE, and my involvement with this. Okay, so I'm a teacher and head teacher at TAFE, and I'm not that anymore. I'm an AMEP coordinator, but my substantive position is still as a teacher. Now, basically, CSWE was always the sort of domain of AMES, and AMES, just by, I think, just an accident, you know, just got absorbed into TAFE New South Wales. That's AMES New South Wales, got absorbed into TAFE New South Wales progressively over the last couple of years. So along with AMES came the license to the CSWE. So I had worked on the reaccreditation of the TAFE New South Wales ATESOL suite of courses in 2016, 2017. So the unit in TAFE, to which I now belong, which is the AMEP SEE Contract Management Unit, felt that it was appropriate to get the same people that worked on the TAFE reaccreditation to work on the CSWE, because basically we knew how to do it. And it's a very long and complicated process, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So I've been a teacher since, I've been a teacher of adults for a long time. I'm actually a yoga teacher as well, but I've been teaching ESL since 2005, and I have an interest in I guess the academic side of ESOL and curriculum, and that's what led me into doing this sort of curriculum work. And so now I have the I have the experience of having gone through the hoops of CSWE, and because I know that whole process, and I'm going to share a lot of that with you today, and some of that I think will answer some of the questions. Thank you for the questions, by the way. It's a great list of questions, and I hope to answer some of them today through what I present first, and I hope that through the activity that we do today, some of those questions will be answered as well, and I'll answer them all sort of individually next week. Yeah, that's just a little bit about me. Yeah, as I said, I was a teacher and a head teacher in TAFE. A head teacher is like it's the head of a section, so it's a crappy job. But you basically you're responsible for everything. So that's my experience with this. I'll share my screen. So I'll get my PowerPoint up and going, and I'll share my screen, and we can actually start. Let's see, we'll try that again. Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yep. It's I've got it sort of halfway down, so I'll get it back to the top. I'm going to leave it down the side. Is that all right? Is that big enough for everyone to see, or do you want me to put it on full screen?
We can see the big boxes. We can't see down the side.
That's okay. Which side can't you see down?
We can see the first PowerPoint, but we can't see your list of PowerPoints.
Okay, that's all right. So you can see like the whole big black square, yeah, which says understanding and using. Yep. Okay, that's all. That's all that's important. So.
I even want to shut off the sidebar.
Sorry,
Shut off the sidebar.
Shut off the sidebar. Okay, all right. I'll go to that.
Yeah, go to slideshow.
Slideshow. Yeah, where is it?
Slideshow, and that will allow you to.
Oh God. Yep. Coming. Okay, how's that? Can you see it?
It's the same.
It's the same. It's gone to my other screen. I'll have to reshare.
Don't worry. It's fine. Darren. Don't worry.
Okay.
It's fine. Okay.
The big one.
All right. Let's get rid of the slideshow then. All right. So you see the screen which says outline? Okay. All right. So this is just what I'm going to go through most of today. I hope to spend around I mean, it's a little bit of chalky talky at the beginning, so no chalk, but all PowerPoint and me. And feel free to ask questions and interrupt me at any time. You know, so I'm good with that. So basically, you know, I think it's important to go through a lot of the vet stuff because unfortunately we live in the vet world, you know, and a lot of the struggles I can see that, you know, that commonly people have with the new format of the CSWE has to do with that, you know, so it's driven by compliance. It's a compliance driven environment. And basically if you don't meet the format, you don't meet the sort of standards that they want, then you don't get a course. You know, it's as simple as that. So, you know, you've either got to play ball with ASQA, and I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute, or you just, you know, you're not in the game. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how VET impacts upon our course, and a little bit about the process of reaccreditation and what's involved, because that gives you an idea of some of the background, can also help to answer some of those questions and what our approach was. So basically the rewriting was done by, the bulk of the rewriting was done by myself and a colleague of mine who has similar interest and background, Chris Watkins, also head teacher, now a team leader in TAFE. So so we talk about what our approach was. You know, touch wood, you know, I don't think you'll have any trouble with how we were approaching that, because we came, you know, with a strong focus on the teaching background, but then you've basically got to balance the other limitations that you're working with. So I'll have a bit of an overview of what's changed. I want to spend a bit of time talking about the format because I think that's one of the key sources of problem. So the streamline units of competency format, you know, we're in a training package environment and we got to play by those rules. So part of our exercise today will be unpacking that streamline unit of competence, or unpacking the streamline format and unpacking a unit of competence with the view to planning and delivering and assessing, you know, a component of the course. Because it's so threadbare, you know, it's a streamline unit of competence. Because it's so threadbare, it doesn't give you a lot of guidance. Like the old CSWE documents used to give you lots of guidance about how to go about it and so on. It doesn't give you much. So you've got to dig in there and pull it out. And that's half the problem. A little bit of discussion also about programming CSWE. So, you know, choosing units and stuff about the course documents. So I'm not sure if people have access to the course documents, and I'll show them to you and I'll encourage you to find access to them if you don't. And a little bit of planning, you know, and a practice exercise working around that and discussing. So that's my proposal for today. So yeah, probably first half an hour, 40 minutes, talk about these things and then get you going on the things that Helen's given out. So here we go. So the VET environment. So this conditions a lot of how the course looks, basically, and the hoops that we had to jump through and how we had to, what we had to do and the limitations that we have are largely driven by the fact that we live within VET. Now, so we don't have a lot of choice, you know, in the adult sector, you know, so either we're part of higher education, which we're not really, we're not part of the schools, you know, though CSWE is used in schools. And so that leaves us part of, you know, the sort of broader vocational education and training, adult ed sector, which is a subset of vocational education and training. You know, the community sector, which uses vocational education and training courses. If we didn't have these courses accredited, basically we wouldn't get funding, you know, so funding is tied to accreditation. If you can run a course, you can design a course for anything, and as indeed ELICOS colleges do. But you know, that's pay. You know, user pays, and our clients don't have money. You know, we're reliant upon government funding. So, and we're reliant upon government funding regimes, whether they be state or Commonwealth. And in the case of the Adult Migrant English Program and SEE, it's Commonwealth. But you know, other in New South Wales, we have state-funded courses as well. I'm not sure how it is in Canberra, and I'm assuming that in other states as well, it's similar. So in all of those different environments, CSWE is used, but we're stuck with VET. You know, that's where we are. So we've got to play by those rules. And now the administrating, or the VET regulator, the authority that looks over VET throughout most of Australia, apart from the states of Victoria and Western Australia, is the Australian Skills and Quality Authority, or ASQA. Now ASQA, you know, they've got teeth. They never used to have teeth. They have teeth now, and they can enforce their you know, their regulations. So basically, you have to follow them, and the whole compliance, you know, stuff that we have to meet. That's all driven and overseen by ASQA. So when you go to accredit a course, and I'll talk a little bit more about the place of accredited courses in a second. You have to follow the Australian Qualifications framework. So one of the questions that somebody put up was, where does CSWE fit into, you know, higher education and qualifications? It fits in because it's part of VET, but it follows the Australian Qualifications framework, which is shortened to the AQF. So I'll just cut, if I can, to, can you see my Google screen? No, okay, all right. Let me just, see, just a second. Okay. All right, so if I type AQF into Google, I get this thing, the Australian Qualifications Framework. And I'm going to show you this for a reason, because this conditions the way that the courses look. In previous iterations of the CSWE, I noticed in 2013, they had to follow these guidelines, but not as tightly as what we have to follow them now. So can you see that as I'm scrolling down? So, you know, I'm at the contents page of this AQF document. And if I just go to Assert 1, what the Australian Qualifications Framework does is basically sets out the types of skills and the level of those skills and knowledge that a person, or that a course at a Certificate 1, a Certificate 2, a Certificate 3, and so on, all the way up to a PhD, what they will have. So when ASQA looks at our accreditation documents, they come back to this document because they want to see that we are meeting these guidelines. So basically, you have to use the language of a Certificate 1. You have to demonstrate that the graduates of the course are going to have the knowledge and skills which will be appropriate for Cert 1. So that's knowledge and skills for initial work, community involvement, and or further learning. And it's supposed to be foundational knowledge, you know, to demonstrate autonomy only in very highly structured and stable contexts. So it means basically very narrow kind of set of situations where there's a lot of guidance. And the types of language that we were forced to write, the unit titles and the titles of the elements of competence and the performance criteria in, had to conform to what would be expected from, for example, a Cert 1 at a Cert 1. So basic, the word basic, you'll see that a lot. So basic fundamental knowledge and understanding in a narrow area of work and learning. Well, we're not preparing people for work. Well, you know, we are kind of indirectly, you know, but, you know, your work is not to speak and read and write English, you know, that's part of living. But we somehow have to conform to this context where, you know, everything is about for work, like the foundation skills training package, everything is for work. So somehow or other, we've got to, you know, show that what we're doing is relevant and is going to end up, you know, conforms to these particular requirements. So basic fundamental knowledge, basic skills to participate in everyday life and further learning, cognitive, communicative skills to receive, pass on, recall information in a narrow range of areas. So that's like a Certificate 1. And it goes up progressively through the certificates. Some autonomy, defined context, established parameters, and so on. And then, so those are restrictions that come with the AQF, with the Australian Qualifications Framework. So whatever certificate we're looking at, whether it be a Certificate 1, a Certificate 2, a Certificate 3, and so on, has to conform to, you know, these particular requirements. And the volume of learning was another question that somebody asked about, but the volume of learning is how much learning a person will do who's undertaking that course. How much is required to get them to the other end where they're going to have those skills and knowledge that you're saying you're going to give them in, when they undertake this particular course. So in a certificate one, it's typically half a year to a full year, so it's, they guesstimate it at about 600 hours. So when we're writing, and this is a Cert 1, so when we're writing our course, we need to make sure that we can show that a student who's undertaking certificate 1 in CSWE is actually going to undertake 600 or thereabouts, ballpark 600 hours of learning, and so on. So, that's why you see that the numbers of hours on the units and so on is in that, is for that reason. It's governed by the AQF and governed by us needing to meet the AQF standards. So that's where that comes from. So I'm just going to go out of that screen and I'll go back to where I was before. So, okay, can you see am I back on the PowerPoint? Can you see that? Yep. Okay. All right. So that's the AQF and how that kind of, we're governed by that. And the ASQA, when they look at your course, they're pedantic on words and word change. So if you're using words which look like they, describing skills or and even just down to adjectives that you use, if it looks like it belongs in a higher certificate, they'll send the course back to you and say, fix it up. And you get only one chance. So if you don't fix it up within 21 days, they give you 21 days, they say, fix it up. If you don't fix it up to their standards, you don't get the course through. It's that kind of ruthless. Second thing that we have to look at are the RTO standards. So, this stuff is as dry as a bone, so it's just all regulatory stuff and so on. But when you submit a course to, for accreditation, it has to meet the standards, so there are standards of accredited courses that go along with it that fit in with the RTO standards. So that's how they assess you, so every RTO has to fit in with the RTO standards, and the guidelines for accredited courses and training packages are, marry up with those standards. So the next point here is the fact that we now have courses that look like training packages. So the VET environment is well, training packages rule the roost. That's how they view education. It's competency-based education on steroids. It's competency-based education, sort of uber, it's at its zenith, in terms of how they view it. And ASQA takes a particularly reductionist view, what I would call a reductionist view to competency-based education. It is or it isn't. It looks like this, it must look like this. And they've got their guidelines, they've got their particular narrow view of what competency-based education should look like, and you have to meet that if you're going to put up things for accreditation. So, and that view is sort of an evolving thing of, having dealt with ASQA for a couple of years. So it's something that I realized their own understanding, or the powers that be within ASQA, their own understanding of how competency-based education should be and what it should look like, that's kind of changed. And so every year they update, they change their requirements slightly. And so they give you some grace, if you're accrediting a course in the year before, they let you kind of be, according to the standards with which you were working towards. But they have a cutoff date, and they, they make you conform to their upgraded standards. So, and so every year they offer training and how to write courses and so on, because, it's not an easy thing to do. So basically, accredited courses are courses that fill the gaps that training packages don't cover. So, can anyone tell me the training package that is most closely associated with our area? Off the top of your head, do you know? What training package is most closely associated with English language teaching? Is there one? FSK? Foundation Skills Training Package? It's not English language. I very vehemently hold that position. It's not at all about English language learning. It's not about English language acquisition, but it nevertheless is a training package that is somehow, you know, we get lumped in. This is a historical kind of mistake, which Helen could probably talk about nicely, you know, but we get lumped in with foundation skills, and this is a problem that we face in our funding environment, in our regulatory environment. English language acquisition is not foundation skills. It sort of has an overlap. Foundation skills, to me, and this is my interpretation of foundation skills, this is a particular axe that I have to grind, having been a course writer. Foundation skills is literacy and numeracy, you know, and associated, you know, language, and it's really predominantly for native speakers. It's not, you know, it's, you know, if you have a person who's coming as an EAL client or English as an additional language client, they may have great foundation skills, they just don't have language, you know. So our courses are really about learning language. So because there is no training package that covers English language learning, therefore we are able to get away with saying that. They don't like it. ASQA doesn't like it. They want everything to map back to a training package. So they will, as far as possible, say, your course looks like a training package. Your course looks like the Foundation Skills Training Package. The Foundation Skills Training Package can be used, and, you know, is used indeed. In fact, it's perverted for teaching English language courses, but they'll say, oh, it can be adjusted. It's the same set of skills, and, you know, that, you know, you can adjust it to different contexts. You should be using that. Foundation Skills Training Package is totally unsuitable for teaching, you know, English as an additional language, in my view, you know. So it can be twisted. I know probably some of you sitting in the room there would have taught the Foundation Skills Training Package, and you would have taught ESL. And indeed, in the C program, that's what happens, you know, but that doesn't mean that that's best practice, you know. So when we accredit an English as additional language course, such as CSWE, we have to demonstrate how learning English as an additional language is different to learning foundation skills, and that's part of the struggle. So when you write the units, when you write units of competency, when you write the course, you have to be quite different. You have to demonstrate different skills and different outcomes to what that training package will give you. Otherwise, because they don't allow repetition. They don't allow you to duplicate a training package. If you duplicate the training package, sorry, you can't have the course, you must use the training package. That's the rules, you know. And so, so our courses fill in the gaps. Our courses sit in between, you know. So, and that's those courses that cover skills and knowledge that are not covered by training packages in the vet world are called accredited courses. So CSWE is a suite of accredited courses, just as the TAFE English language curriculum is a set of accredited courses. So CSWE is also delivered in schools, by the way. So, and it's delivered as a non-accredited course. So that means that they don't have to tick all the boxes for the vet compliance. Okay, so that's a little bit of broad background. Now, the process of reaccreditation is driven by ASQA's guidelines. So you have a template. When you want to accredit a course, you have a template that they provide. It's all on their webpage. So, you know, all the guidelines are on their webpage. So there's standards for accredited courses that they hold you to, and the standards for accredited courses, as I said, marry up to the RTO standards. So now you have to show how you meet those standards. You have to know those standards, and you have to design your course, and you have to present your course in a format that meets those standards. So those standards, they have a template for how units of competence should look. They have templates for what particular information they require in the course documents, and you've got to go and basically research and put that together. And to write a suite of accredited courses, well, if you're really, you know, a hot shot, you can do it in a couple of months, but, you know, it's going to be really difficult. So, you know, to do CSWE took us the best part of a year. As a part of that, you know, as I said, the required format is like a training package and aligned to the AQF. But one of the first things that you have to do, and there's a field for that in the template that you're following. So there's course documents, and then there's the course, there's the course application form, and then there's course documents, and they relate together. So you've got to consult stakeholders. Now, stakeholders can be anyone, you know, so they can be community, employer, educational, basically those industry, those fields, you know. So you know, it's in your interest when you're accrediting a course to show how it demonstrates employment outcomes, or it feeds your graduates into employment-driven outcomes. So, you know, that strengthens your case for getting a course accredited. So, you know, we had a wide range of stakeholders. We had some different government bodies. We had, you know, we had groups representing employers. We had FECA, which is the, I can't remember what FECA stands for. It's the Ethnic Affairs Council, you know. So we had the refugee, I can't remember the name of the peak refugee body as well, because, you know, we know our clients actually, you know, utilize those services and are looked after by those bodies. So I looked after the services they utilize are looked after by those bodies. We also had academics, and we had ACTA, and we had, you know, so we had Susan Fees, who was a, you know, one of the original CSWE writers. And, you know, so a range of different stakeholders. We also had QA providers. So we had NIAS, who were terrific, and we had LWA, who is the current QA provider for the AMEP. So, and that was kind of representing the ACSF, you know. So we had a range of stakeholders, but we could have chosen, you know, sort of Joe Bloggs if we could, or, you know, if we could justify, you know, the choice of that particular person or organization, you know. So, you know, and so, but, you know, we chose as broad a range and as relevant a range of stakeholders as we possibly could. Another thing that we did was we conducted user surveys. So we designed a survey and we sent that out to every licensee. So every organisation that held a license for CSWE under the previous contract, in the previous, you know, iteration of CSWE, we wrote to all of them. And now not everyone responds to that type of survey. So, and then when you send that type of survey, it doesn't always reach the floor. So, you know, it goes to someone in the office, or it goes to a director or a manager or a, you know, a head of studies or something like that. And they may answer the questions if they answer at all, or they may allocate someone to answer the questions. It doesn't always get down to teachers. When we were lucky, there were teachers involved, you know. So, you know, and we had some good respondents to surveys, and some of those people joined advisory groups, you know. So from the users, we also, you know, I mean, and I'll talk about the student surveys in a minute, but from the providers, we put together. Hello, yeah, question? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Okay. You might like to find out how many people in this room filled in one of those surveys. That's one thing I wanted to say. And the second thing was, could you just clarify, when you say certificates aligned to the AQF?
Yes.
Do you mean all training packages are aligned to the AQF, or just the CSWE?
No, they all are. They have to. They have to. Yeah, that's the framework against which all qualifications are measured. You know, so everything is governed by the AQF. The AQF is that sort of master document that sets out levels of skills and knowledge and degrees of autonomy and depth of learning, or depth of skills and depth of knowledge at each certificate level. So, you know, it's kind of the basic descriptor. So it's not just applicable to English language courses, it's just all courses within VET. So it's sort of a kind of a meta document. You know, it's the AQF it's publicly available, as I showed you. And it's, you know, it makes sense. It's not a bad document, you know. So, you know, but it's just a way of sort of providing a framework against which, you know, your level of qualification and skills and so on can be measured.
Okay.
You know, so yeah.
So maybe you want to find out how many people in this room actually knew anything about this.
I would be interested.
So hands up those who actually filled in the survey for the reaccredited assessment.
Is Sharon there? Sharon Gilbert?
So I did the survey and the advisory.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
Sharon.
Oh, you're Sharon. Oh.
Yeah, because I remember Sharon, that's why. But Sharon, you were at Charles Darwin, I think, then. So, yes, yeah. But I don't remember anyone else's names, you know, so, you know. Did anyone see them? Yes or no?
No.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's a problem, you know. So, you know, when we're putting out those surveys, like, you know, it's a bit like fishing, you know, you put them out hoping that they'll find the right audience, which is teachers, you know, particularly. And we know that that's not necessarily going to happen. We can't control that, you know, that's just a function of the organization, you know. So we found out some really interesting things through the surveys. We got some great responses, you know, so it was very informative. But, you know, I can't remember off the top of my head the number of license holders. You know, it was, you know, a few hundred, you know, but only a percentage of license holders got back to us, you know. But what we received was definitely helpful, you know, and it definitely informed us. So we got good guidance about what was working in the course and what wasn't working, and that was the sort of thing that we asked, you know. So, you know, what sort of changes would you recommend, you know? And some people drilled down to individual modules as they were in the old course, and we tried as best as we could to accommodate those, given the format and limitations coming from ASQA and the AQF and so on that we had to stick to. But we tried to accommodate a lot of that as much as we could, you know. So, but overwhelmingly, you know, from the user surveys and the advisory groups, it was, you know, there was a couple of big themes that were pretty resounding, and they were reduced the amount of assessment, number one. The courses themselves have a reduced amount of assessment. They have a less assessment burden. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was, because they're used in the AMEP, aligned them more closely to the ACSF. So that was a kind of resounding theme. Now, you know, Chris and I are both sort of, you know, diehard ESL teachers, so we don't particularly like the ACSF. You know, and I think that's probably a common sentiment. I mean, in some ways it's okay, but not for what we do, you know. So, you know, but we just basically had to grit our teeth and say, okay, how can we do this in as sensible a way as possible without compromising our profession? You know, so, and that's actually what we did, or what we tried to do, you know. So, you know, if we wanted, you know, full alignment to the ACSF, you might as well just use the bloody ACSF as a curriculum, you know. So, which is what invariably happens with, you know, with the AMEP program and the way that the QA is done. They, you know, and the fact that you've got progressive assessments that have to be, you know, scaled against the ACSF. It's double the load of compliance, you know, and that's a flaw in the program's design, and that's no one's fault but the department. So, you know, but anyway, I mean, I think we live in that environment. So, but, you know, we were determined not to do that. We were determined not to write the ACSF as a curriculum, you know, and yet we also needed to have some alignment to the ACSF. So we basically wrote our units of competence, and this is kind of getting onto one of the next slides, but we wrote our units of competence with, in one hand, the ISLPR, because that was our standard, and in the other hand, the ACSF. So we tried to word the wording in the units of competence in a way that could be seen to marry up with ACSF performance features, in a way that was also not going to compromise the integrity of the actual courses. So you were still going to be teaching ESL, students were still going to be learning English. They weren't going to be learning core skills for learning, or, you know, foundation skills. So the foundation skills come by the by, you know, but, you know, the focus will always be, and still is in CSWE, it still is English as an additional language. So, anyway, I mean, that's I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's how it worked. And like we got good information from the user surveys, we also got good input from the advisory groups, and we made adjustments to what we were doing based upon the feedback that we got from them. So advisory groups were also, you know, provider representatives. So we did have, Sharon was on one or two of the advisory groups from memory, but also we had people from Navitas, people from TAFE, people from SA TAFE, and the people from Queensland TAFE declined because they've got their core skills for learning course. You know, so we had a range of users to give feedback, you know, and I think the advisory groups were well compiled. I mean, the people on the advisory groups were all from teaching backgrounds, and they all knew what they were talking about, and they were able to give us good feedback. So, you know, that part of it works well. It's just it would have been good if we could have got a broader range of users, you know, to give feedback. Having said that, sometimes when people give feedback as users, and this is also a recurring theme, because, you know, quite often as a teacher on the ground, you don't understand the limitations that your provider may have actually put on you. You know, your provider may have limited your choice of units of competence or modules, etc., that you're delivering. They may have limited the number of hours that you have to deliver a course in, etc. You know, so those are actually choices made by the organisation, and they may not necessarily have anything to do, or, you know, much to do with the actual course rules, which is why I want to show you the course rules documents a little bit later. So that's important. Okay, so the way that we approached it, so Chris and I approached this, was we wanted to retain the spirit of the CSWE. So we wanted to retain the text-based approach, you know, so, and that was our guiding principle. That was the first thing that we, you know, right, we're keeping that, you know, we're not going to go to the ACSF, we're going to keep that, we're going to use the ISLPR. We would be informed by what our users told us. So student surveys, by the way, we had copies of student evaluations via the NCVR surveys, and also our own TAFE surveys. We had plenty of those from using CSWE. So we had some guidance from, you know, student feedback. I mean, student feedback is variable. Some of it's not useful, and some of it's very useful. So, you know, that was also part of the mix. Now, the whole thing was a balancing act, really, you know, so balancing competing limitations and priorities. As I was saying, you have to meet ASQA requirements first. If you don't do that, you don't have a course. You know, basically you do it or you don't, you know, so it's okay, all right, you know, we've got to come to the table, we've got to play by their rules. We took an evidence-based approach to things. So, to the ISLPR in particular, and I'll talk about that in a second, and to module and course usage. So we had data from the NCVER, which is the National Centre for Vocational Education Research. So that provided us with data on module usage in the old course. So we had modules in the old course, module and course usage. So which course, how many people did the course, how many people were enrolled, which modules were they enrolled in, and also how many people actually completed the course. You know, so it was fairly low completion rates for CSWE. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but they were not, you know, statistically high. So it's not like we're getting 70 or 80% of the people to complete their certificates, you know, so, but, you know, we definitely had, you know, many, many thousands of people enrolled in the courses. You know, we're talking, you know, 25, 30,000 people, actually probably up to 60, you know, per year. I'm just trying to remember the figures. And, you know, so we had 3 years worth of figures, 2014, 15 and 16. So that also guided us in terms of, you know, what to do with the modules and the skills. And the ISLPR guided us in terms of what we would include in the levels. Now, Chris and I had a bone to pick with the ISLPR because, you know, in the old CSWE courses, and the preamble to the old CSWE courses is fantastic. It's just an instructive professional development in English language teaching. That first 60 pages is a great read, you know, but there are some tables in those pages that I always myself had felt were a little bit odd, you know. Now given I have grown up in my sort of career as an English language teacher, I've always worked in the vet sector. I never worked overseas. You know, so I've always, you know, been kind of coached towards an evidence-based approach, which is basically, you know, it's competency-based, it's evidence-based. They can do it, they can demonstrate this skill, they can demonstrate that skill, they know how to do that, and you can give them an assessment which is going to show that, and, you know, your ducks are in a row. So we took an evidence-based approach to the ISLPR, which meant basically, you know, because I'd looked at the ISLPR, even right back to my early days as an English language teacher, I thought, hang on, that doesn't marry up. You know, what it says in the ISLPR is not what those certificates are teaching. So I'll demonstrate this to you. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a second and I'll show you my PDF screens. So, okay, so let's go back. Okay, can you see my ISLPR here? Yep, okay. I've got writing 1+ transactional proficiency. Now I've chosen this as a fairly illustrative example of what I'm talking about and why the ISLPR levels are, you know, different to what they used to be. This is one of the main things. Okay, so now what I've got on here is part of the old CSWE, the CSWE 2013, so 10364 NAT. So this is your, this particular module is comprehending and composing discussions. Okay, so it's a reading and writing unit. So there's, you know, to just illustrate a point about these are assessment criteria. They're not the same as in the new course, but there are things about the way they're written which simply ASQA just wouldn't accept. You know, they would say, oh, they're classroom tasks or they're assessment tasks. You can't have that. So they wouldn't let us write things like that. They wouldn't let us be so instructive in the format. But that's not directly what I want to show you now. Write a discussion. Okay, so in a CSWE, the entry ISLPR for CSWE 3, and this is from CSWE 3, was ISLPR 1+. So, okay, let's have a look at firstly at what you've got to do. So if you're studying CSWE 3 and you've entered with an ISLPR 1+, you have to learn how to write a discussion. That, you know, that's not a small thing to do. You've got to write a coherent discussion. You've got to use appropriate text structure, whatever that means. But I'm assuming that means an essay format, you know, so introduction, body, conclusion with paragraphs that are cohesive and linked together. And then indeed, that's actually what it says. Use linking devices to develop the discussion. Write coherent paragraphs that express arguments for and against and provide evidence and to substantiate your arguments. That's not low, you know, that they're not low skills. Use topic sentences to focus on and organize arguments. Use appropriate conjunctive links. Use grammatical structures of appropriate complexity, whatever appropriate means. Okay, so appropriate, we understand, you know, means it's got to work. You know, it's got to work in a further study context, because this is a further study unit without a doubt. At a certificate 3, remembering if it's going to be AQF 3, you know, it has to be a fairly high level. So AQF 3, certificate 3, to give you a perspective on how the vet world looks at that. So AQF 3 is the base qualification for most trades. So, you know, if you're going to study to be a plumber or a carpenter, you're going to study those courses for a couple of years, you know, and there has to be, you know, it's actually for a certificate 3, it's between 12 to 2,400 hours of study. That's the recommended volume of learning, plus on the job, you know, so you know, it's huge. And that level of skills are the routine skills that will be performed on a job, you know. So if we translate that back into the level of skill in English language, well, that's not insubstantial. You know, that's a fairly competent user. I mean, they're going to be making some mistakes, but it's a reasonably competent user. So if we go back to our ISLPR for entry, 1+, now, I would argue that someone coming in with a 1+, let's have a look at the sort of things that they can do. You know, so they can write simple transactional communications. This is the middle column, you know, such as a note to school or giving a simple explanation of a child's absence. Simple, okay, not, you know, sort of more complex than that. A letter to request information about accommodation or other services, although the conventions, particularly of more formal text, may often be inappropriate. Okay, can write notes and simple letters to friends in social situations, such as informal invitations to functions. Can write very simple reports at work using mainly a pro forma with some annotations. Now, let's see. Can use a bilingual dictionary. You know, the communication will be meaningful to a colleague, although the conventions of the relevant genre may not be observed. Okay, so it's still not very high. Using simple connectives such as and, but, or, so, when, because, and tentative use of if. So go back to over here. We've got to provide, you know, express arguments for and against, provide evidence to support arguments. Are you going to be able to teach someone with this coming in with this level of English to be able to do that? Let's go over here a little bit. So learners cannot present a coherent argument in argument and discussion text. although they may use some of the more superficial features of such texts. Lack of coherence in these and other extended text results from a range of developmental factors. So then we come back over here. Grammatical errors may often cause or contribute to misunderstanding where there is less support from the context. Word order and other grammatical forms are influenced by L1. Uses basic referential cohesive devices, but many are unreliable, especially when they are relatively separated from their reference. Can you see what I'm saying here? This is a fairly low, it's a post-beginner. I speak a second language. My second language is Turkish. I'm about this level in Turkish, a little bit lower, and I'm not terribly functional. I couldn't write a discussion essay in Turkish, yet, if you have someone coming in with a 1+, are you going to get them up to that level in 500 hours? I don't think so. So personally, I don't think so. That's going to take a lot longer for that person. That person's probably going to be more comfortably sitting in a Cert 2, and you're going to get them to a place in 500 or 600 hours worth of study. You might do it over a semester in a shorter amount of time, but you're going to get them to a place where they're probably able to start doing that in their next course or even the one after. So for those sorts of reasons, I mean, you look, and this is just one isolated example. You could look across speaking, you could look across reading, you could look across listening, and there is a similar pattern. So in some of it, yes, and some of it, no, because the ISLPR is kind of a mixed bag, and it wasn't really designed to be, driven into a competency-based environment like we're using it. So I mean, and to be honest, I would probably argue for moving away from the ISLPR for that reason. It's quite opaque. It's owned by an organisation, and fair enough, it's their copyright. They like to see that people are, have been trained by them, but that doesn't necessarily fit with the vet environment. But having said that, this is what we've got, so, and this is what we still use. So what basically Chris Watkins and I did was pull competencies out of here, what they can and can't do, looked at the certificates. Our first we based the actual courses on the skill levels within the certificates. So we tried not to play much with the levels of the certificates. So what was a Cert 1 before, broadly, not specifically, but broadly is still a Cert 1 now. What was broadly a Cert 2 before, if you're going by the certificates and the skills described in the certificates, what was taught in a Cert 2 before is still taught, broadly speaking, in a Cert 2. And is still taught, broadly speaking, in a Cert 3. So you've got your discussion essays and your further study texts and so on still sitting in your Cert 3, for example. We played around with the ISLPRs in terms of entry and then also exit, because if I'll just stop sharing this screen and I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Just get rid of that. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint again?
Yeah.
Yep, okay, so we basically twigged the entry and exit points. So in the old certificate, you never had exit points. You only ever had entry points. And the entry points, why they were drawn so low, they took, as Susan Fays explained to us, and Helen De Silva Joyce also explained to us, and Helen, I know Helen from university, she was my teacher. So, they both explained to us, they kind of had a bit of a chuckle at the ISLPR, and they said, oh, the ISLPR can be flexibly interpreted, and that was the approach they took, and they fixed the entry points low enough to be able to get under the bar of the definition of functional English. So the Department of Immigration's definition of functional English was always ISLPR 2. That's actually pretty low, So you look, if you go back and read the document, the ISLPR, and you look at it, yeah, okay, that's kind of a lower intermediate learner. That's someone who can go to the shop and kind of buy what they want. They can kind of argue with a tradesman about the price of something, but they can't do more elaborate things than that. They can give they can provide an opinion about something, but not a very elaborate one with well-constructed arguments and so on. That was functional English. And, I would argue that that's way too low for functional English. You can't expect people to, you know, people can work with that level of English, but what type of job are they going to work in? You know, either something they already have skills for, or something where they're just going to be stuck in it, you know, like a factory work or something like that. They're not going to be able to go and you know, because they need so much literacy to study, you know, to actually study higher qualifications and further ed. So they're not going to be able to go and do a lot with it with an ISLPR 2. So those levels were set low so that we could get most of the certificates under the bar of functional English, you know. So that was a pragmatic decision, but that was a decision which actually had other implications. So, you know, ISLPRs, in my view, ISLPRs going back prior to CSWE 2018 and in the previous AMEP contracts, ISLPRs were known vicariously through CSWE levels, you know. So were in actual fact, you know, people would know the CSWE level and they would know where the student should be placed based upon the CSWE level, and the ISLPR was married up with that, you know. So, you know, but you dig into the ISLPR, it's sort of a bit more full of contradictions and kind of, you know, circumlocutions and you know, sort of it's sort of esoteric language in some places. So you've got to dig into it and pull things out of it, and you know, so we did that. As I said, from an evidence-based or competency-based approach. Not everyone's going to agree with that. That's not the way that it was used in the past. But, you know, given that we operate in a vet environment, which is heavily driven by evidence-based and competency-based view of life, you know, that was what we decided to, you know, we felt that we needed to address that. So having said that too, ASQA makes us set a benchmark for an exit level of a course. So you've got to have a way of judging the competence of a student coming out the other end. So therefore, we had to set exit benchmarks, you know, and we peg those back against the ISLPR too. So in some cases, you know, we had to draw them arbitrarily, and we thought very long and hard about those course boundaries, you know. So should it be a 1+, should it be a 2, should it be a 2+, because the jumps in the ISLPR are not regular, you know. It's not a sort of a lockstep, you know, sort of clean, you know, 1, 2, 3 building blocks that are all exactly the same. It's not like that. It's very irregular, and it is actually reflective of learning a second language, because, you know, really ballpark is kind of good enough, you know, and, you know, you really just want the language, and gives you an idea of kind of how much language a person has and what they can do with it and how good they are, what's going on inside them, you know, when they're struggling and trying to learn their language. From that perspective, ISLPR is pretty good. You know, so that's why there are issues with the ISLPR. So the old world is different to the new world. The interpretation we took, you know, given that ISLPR can be flexibly interpreted, the interpretation we took is of competency-based, evidence-based, and therefore, and we were forced to set exit levels. So therefore, the upper level of the courses may be a bit higher than what it was before. The entry level, therefore, may also seem a little bit higher, even if the skills are broadly similar. Now,
Darren,
yep.
I'm looking at the clock.
Yep.
And we've got
Everyone's bored shitless.
no, I was just thinking this might be a spot up to you.
Yep.
People might be starting to have a few questions. Would you like to take questions now, or do you want to move to the ACSF before we take them?
Let me finish this screen, and then you can fire me some questions related to what I've talked to you about already. You know, so yeah. So when I was talking about the text-based approach, you know, and in order to fit in with all of these things here, what Chris and I did was, you know, and given the feedback we got to, you know, sort of reduce the amount of assessment, to align it better to the ACSF, given that our new definition of functional English is now ACSF 3. So I'll talk about that in a second. We grouped some modules together and made much larger units. And there were a couple of places where we shifted modules into either the course above or the course below. So there's those kind of subtle differences are there. Now, to come back to the new definition of functional English, ACSF 3 is considerably higher than ISLPR 2. You know, even if you can't decide on an exact boundary, because exact equivalences you're never going to get that, because we're measuring apples and oranges, you know. So yes, they're both fruit, but, you know, they're still apples and oranges. So, you know, So ACSF 3 is quite a bit higher. So that allows us to have more clients in the AMEP, but it also presents other difficulties. So, you know, we try, as I said, we tried to make the course more usable with the ACSF, and at the end of the day, it's still a compromise. So, you know, it's by no means perfect. So, and I could see from the range of questions that people presented forward, you know, there's still, you know, there's going to be those sort of issues. Okay, so questions.
I just wanted to say or ask, can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
So what you're saying is that with the AMEP with 510 hours, there's really no chance that someone is going to get, say, a CSWE certificate 1 if you need about 600 hours to complete the course. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's a good question, and it's quite a reasonable question. The volume of learning, you know, is got to be ballpark at 600. So it is. There's a range of. I'll show you when I go into the units. You know, there's a range of nominal hours that sit with the courses that are ballpark for a Cert 1. So remember, CSWE is CSWE, AMEP is AMEP. CSWE has been traditionally used in the AMEP. In the previous contract, it was the mandated course, the mandated curriculum. In contracts before that, it was not mandated, so you could use other courses. And again, it is no longer mandated. But having said that, CSWE is still traditionally used as you know, predominantly in the AMEP, but it's also used in other environments. So whatever environment you're using it in, you know, you're meant to be able to demonstrate 600 hours of volume of learning, but you may only have classroom time of 360 hours, for example. Say you run it over 20 weeks of 20 hours a week, you know, so you get your students coming in and, you know, you start your term and they're all coming full time, ducks in a row, that's great. So they're all coming 20 hours a week and they're going to do 20 weeks at 20 hours a week. So in one term, you'll do 10 weeks, the next term you do another 10 weeks and you get them through the course. But you've only actually had them there for 400 hours. You might have given them a bit of homework. You might have assumed that they're going to use their language outside, which you have to. But you may choose to get them through in one semester. And that's a decision that, you know, organisations have to make when they program the CSWE. So, I mean, I'm in TAFE New South Wales, so they usually teach each CSWE certificate over a semester. So, you know, it's a bit trickier with Cert 3, but certainly with Certificate 1 and Certificate 2, they've both got to be ballpark 600 hours, but we'll deliver them in 300 and something, you know, so, and that makes other difficulties, you know. So to answer your question, not strictly, no, you know, but, you know, in 510 hours, if you were to have 510 hours of face-to-face time, you know, and you programmed all of that to be for a Cert 1, which you probably couldn't do. You could do that, or you could choose to do it another way. So how you choose to deliver the course is really up to how the organisation decides it wants to program the course. So that's the answer. You can deliver it in 200 hours if you can justify it. If you can justify it to ASQA, you could deliver it in 200 hours. That would be hard, you know, and I'd say you're probably you're going to leave some gaps. You're going to not give the students their best if you're going to deliver it in 200 hours. But if you can get it in, you know, in 2 terms of, you know, 20 hours a week, or, you know, even 18 hours a week, you're going to get through most of it. You're going to give them a bit of homework. You're going to give them some stuff outside of class. You'll get through it.
Any more questions? Any more comments or anything you want to raise with Darren? Okay, on you go.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, there were questions like that were submitted. So I'll probably repeat this again next week. It doesn't hurt to repeat stuff because there's a lot of information and, you know, not all of it's going to stick. Okay, so what's changed? Major changes. So the format of the courses, as I was saying, it now looks like a training package. So these streamlined units of competence, which seem like they're just bloody skeletons. They don't tell you a lot, you know, so you've got to know how to unpack it and pull it apart. There's less guidance for teachers and assessors, and it's less prescriptive. So less guidance for teachers and assessors. You know, someone wrote in one of their questions that they didn't know what to do, you know, or they didn't know how to go about their teaching and learning because the course doesn't tell you anymore. The course documents don't tell you. What the course documents tell you, pardon me, and the unit guides tell you now is just, it's a statement of the skills and knowledge that a learner should walk out the door once they graduate. That's what they should be having. So they should be able to demonstrate all of those skills that are described in the elements of competence and the performance criteria. And you should have collected evidence that they can do that. So that's the bare minimum. This is the sort of ASQA view on vet and competency-based education. It's the bare minimum. It really bears out. I remember when I was back at uni studying adult ed, you know, and they were talking about Paulo Freire. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he called competency-based education the banking model. So, you know, input one side's like a factory, and then output, you know, you come out the other end with something. And I think this model of education is, you know, and the way that we're forced to do this with these units of competence is very much hearkening back to that type of description. Now, he was being, you know, very critical when he said that, but actually this is the serious view of vocational education and training in Australia in 2019. So there's not a lot of guidance, and it's less prescriptive. The strength of that is that you're free to do it the way you want. You know, it's a strength and a weakness, both. You know, it's a strength because as a conscientious teacher who is in touch with the needs of your learners, you're going to design a course, because you can design the course however you like to get that outcome at the end. You know, you can design, say you've got your students for 2 terms and you're going to teach Cert 1 in 2 terms, and you know you've chosen your units, you know what units you're going to deliver, so you can, you know, you can design a course according to best principles that you know as a teacher. You design your cycles of teaching and learning, you collect your evidence, which you're collecting your evidence and stuff is your compliance requirements, but you can teach them the way you want to. You know, you can put into that course, as long as they're coming out the other end with those skills, you can teach them how you want, you can give them the activities that you want, you can use the most effective ways of getting them to learn that language that you know from your experience, what you know is being good practice, you can do that. So that's the best aspect of this system, is that you're free to actually design a good course within, you know, the restrictions, limitations of funding and compliance, which we're stuck with, you know, but anyway, we're stuck with that. So, but you can do that, or you can be like some of, Dodgy Brothers RTO down the street, you know, and they can, you know, just pump the certificates out and give the students the answers in class and, you know, collect their vet fee help or whatever, and you know, you can do that too. You know, mind you, you've got to pass an ASQA audit if they decide to come down on you, and you risk losing your registration, you know, if you're going to be Dodgy Brothers Inc. But it leaves it open for that possibility, and as we have seen with the crisis of vet education in Australia, we've seen that happen, you know. So and all in between, you know, all variations in between, you know. So, and given that, you know, I mean, providers are also driven by business considerations, and here is where you get the thin edge of the wedge. So, you know, so where does quality get sacrificed for business decisions? You know, and we're being forced into that all the time, unfortunately. As I mentioned before, a closer alignment to the AQF and the ACSF, and as I said, the way we wrote the performance criteria was to have, you know, chains of words where you could see that it was a similar skill to what the ACSF performance feature for those relevant, or, you know, indicators were going to be, you know. So and then we also had to change the course rules. So one of the things that ASQA said to us when we started this particular project, they said, oh, we want simpler course rules. Mind you, the course rules for the old CSWE were pretty simple. It was like, you know, complete 5 modules or complete 7 modules or 9 modules, something like that. 5 modules, complete 7 modules, 2 compulsory, and the other 5 can be, you know, anything, you know, from that particular list. So we had to stick to that. You know, so simple course rules. And we, as I said before, we combined modules into larger units. So we wanted to keep the text-based approach, but we realized we couldn't be as detailed with the text types as you were in the previous course. So we had to put them together in families of texts. And we also had to come up with words that gave you an idea of what those families of texts would be without duplicating the foundation skills training package. Because one of the things that ASQA does when they accredit your course is that they look at the way that you've worded the skills in the units of competence, and they compare it to the relevant training package. And if the words are similar, if the chains of words describe similar things, or if they think that the outcomes, if they read that the outcomes are similar, you know, if they interpret that the skill outcomes are similar, they'll say, no, you can't use that unit of competence, you must use the training package. So you have to be noticeably very different. So we were extra careful. Chris was very cautious about that. You know, so we were extra careful not to duplicate the training package and to make sure that CSWE was about learning English and not about foundation skills. It takes less units to complete the certificate. And so instead of having 7 modules of 80 hours or whatever, you know, you now, for all of the courses bar, I think the Cert 3, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they're all just 5 units. I think the Cert 3 might be 6, can't remember.
That's 5.
5, is it? Okay, all right. Yeah, one of them's got 1 more, I think, you know, it could be the 4. There's less assessment overall. So, you know, to pass the old Cert 3, you had to do 9 modules, and that equated to 36 assessments. You know, so to pass Cert 3 now, you have to do 20 assessments. In the old course, you had to collect 2 pieces of evidence for every learning outcome. You don't need to do that anymore because the sufficiency of evidence is written. No, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Tell me.
Per performance element, you still have to collect 2 different pieces of evidence, according to the example that I've got here.
Yeah, read it out to me, please.
Okay, but this is for the Cert 2,
yeah.
Right, basic factual test.
Yeah.
Under performance evidence, it says you must have read and comprehended 2 different basic factual texts chosen from the following, and then it gives a range. And
yep.
you must have planned, drafted, and written 2
yep.
different basic factual texts with
yep.
you know.
Yep. So that's not 2 pieces of evidence. That's 2. They're separate assessments. So if you've got to have read, you know, demonstrated evidence of reading 2 different texts, you're reading 2 different text types. You don't have to do that twice. In the old CSWE, you had to do that twice for the same assessment, for the same learning outcome. Each one of those is different. Okay, so, yep.
In certificate 3, in reading, read and listen to the news.
Yep.
Do 2 readings of 2 different articles. It's exactly
that's right.
The same task, and 2 listenings to 2 different listening texts. Exactly
yes.
The same task. Why is it repeated for that?
What do you mean the same task?
Well, it might be a different newspaper article, and it might be a different whatever, but
okay.
It's the same task.
Yeah, let me just bring that particular unit up and let's talk about that. Okay, so
read and listen to the news, Cert 3.
Yep. Yep. I'm just going to go to the unit.
It's the same task twice. With read and listen to the news, it's exactly the same task.
Yes.
Well, it's 2 things you have to do. You have to do both things twice.
Well, I know that for the union, it's 2 different things. Yeah, but there are 2. Yeah.
But in read and listen to the news, it says read and comprehend 2 routine news articles. Listen to and comprehend 2 routine TV news. So it's the same task twice.
So content is different, but the task is twice.
Yeah.
Content is different.
They always was, and content is different with the other one as well.
To read and comprehend 2 different short simple social texts. Yeah, 2 different social short. So, I mean, I see there's a subtle difference in what's they were saying. It comes to the same number of
Page
tasks that you have to do.
Page 16, is it?
60.
60, thank you.
Version 261.
Yeah.
Version 3.
Oh, I know. Yeah, this is the one.
So read and listen to the news. All right, here we go. So the learner must show evidence of the ability. I'm going to go over this stuff, and I mean, I don't know whether we're going to actually have a practice today. We're going to end up doing that next week. Read and comprehended 2 routine news articles aimed at a general audience. Listened to and comprehended 2 routine TV news articles aimed at a general audience. So, you know, 2 different news articles. I mean, you've got to have sufficiency. You've got to demonstrate that range of things. You know, in a sense, yes, it is the same task twice, but you're not, you know, you're going to give them 2 different types of articles. I mean, news articles are not all the same. Routine television news articles are not all the same. You know, so there is a good range of stuff that you can give to your learners there, and you've got to demonstrate evidence of all of this knowledge. So, you know, why would you give them the same type of article twice? You know, so you can have an opinion, fact, and bias. There's a great variation of stuff there, and this is a unit which I think, you know, is actually written particularly, you know, to extend learners and to give them a range of language. You know, so and it's a unit where, you know, you're going to be using real life texts. So, you know, yes, it is. You know, broadly speaking, yes, it's the same task twice, read and comprehend, you know, a news article. But, you know, if thinking about teaching and learning and thinking about teaching people language, you know, so I think this unit actually provides a lot of good opportunities to really give your learners a broad range of language, both for their receptive skills. So, I mean, it's, yeah, you know, in a sense, you're right. I don't disagree with that. It is kind of the same task twice, but, you know, would you do the same task twice?
They have to find their own news articles.
Sorry? Yeah.
They have to find their own written news articles, so that's part of the task.
It's not part of the task, okay? It's part of the performance criteria, okay? So in class, would you not get them doing that? You would.
Yes.
Of course you would, you know. So these are the skills, and this comes down to format issues, okay? So how to actually interpret these skeletons of units of competence. So these skills are, you know, our best approximation to the types, and given the limitations that we worked within, in terms of language, of the way that they're written and stuff like that, they're our best approximations to the types of skills that a learner is going to have to develop. You know, so you want to see evidence of them doing that. So you're going to get them to, you know, you're going to get them to look at a range of different texts and, you know, find things that they're interested in, or get them to do a research project, for example, where they go and find things like this. You might teach this unit in tandem with another unit, you know, with one of the other reading and writing units. And so you could actually, in that sense, you know, you could be, you know, using this as part of their research for another unit that you're also assessing. So you're going to get them to do those things, you know. So and you don't have to do that in a standalone summative task, you know, but you want to see evidence of them doing that, you know. So yeah.
Just a sec, Darren.
Yeah.
I think somebody else wanted to say something.
Yes.
It seemed to me that you were saying there's less assessment. Is that right? Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. And then people are pointing out, but it's not less, it's just the same or similar, because you've got to do 2 pieces. Like that argument seems to be what's happening.
If you count, look, it is less assessment. I mean, I want to emphasize here, this is, you know, when we go through the whole lot of this, you actually understand the format of this, it'll be a lot less painful. So, you know, so less assessment. If I count numbers of assessment tasks, if I was to just say they're all summative assessments and count numbers of assessment tasks, there is less assessment. You know, I can go through and I can say there are, you know, to do this unit, and look at the hours on this unit, by the way, as well. Okay, so this is a much larger unit than what you would have done before. This is, I think, 120 hours or something. Yeah, it's 80 hours. Okay, all right. So we've assigned 20 hours per text, you know, so that was part of the things that we had to do. So, you know, in an 80-hour unit, you're going to have covered 4 assessments. So, you know, if you're doing, or 4 tasks, you know, so 20 hours a week, you know, so you've done 1 text type, 20 hours a week, one particular type of news article, and in a cycle of teaching and learning. Yeah, you know, in hindsight, I think, you know, I might have liked to have made this unit a bit longer. You know, if I was thinking about that again. Sometimes you know, you make an estimate of something, and then, you know, it turns out that on feedback and when people actually teach it on class, then, you know, it can be improved. So, I mean, I think that that's probably fair to say that this unit probably should be longer in terms of hours, you know, and the types of language and stuff that you're doing. But if I count the numbers of assessments, so if you want to include each of these as summative task, you know, so numbers of assessment tasks to pass each particular certificate, it is less, you know, so for each particular certificate, you're doing less assessment as per total, you know, so it may be the same as a previous unit where you don't have to collect 2 pieces of evidence. So you don't have to collect 2 pieces of evidence that they have read and comprehended a narrative of approximately 400 or 500 words. So you don't need 2 separate narratives there. You only need 1. You only need 2 where it says you have to do 2. So in read and listen to the news, it says you have to do 2. You know, so therefore this particular unit's probably a little bit assessment heavy. I'll concede that. This particular unit's got 4 assessment tasks in it. You know, so that's the way I would read that. The other units have less, you know, so, and they're taught over a larger amount of time. So, you know, 120-hour units, I think this one might be 120 hours. And so you've got to do 4 assessments in that one too. So you're assessing roughly every 30 hours of class.
Okay, there's another question, Darren.
Yep.
So Darren, is this aligned to ACSF 3?
The simple questions.
No, because
Yeah.
we give student assessments, and we should be able to use the assessment to what is it, to exit them with ACSF 3 or something.
Are you assessing, it's a really good question, okay? So are you assessing for the purposes of the AMEP?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so.
And we still have to do something for ACSF as well.
Yeah, you do, you know, now.
Because then otherwise, you know.
Yep.
I don't know.
We have used ACSF 3 to help us write the performance criteria, but when you say actually aligned, well, you know, I'd have to say, how closely is anything aligned? This is the statement in the course document that I've rolled further up in the course document. This is the statement of equivalence. So you can only ever really be approximate with equivalences, because as I said before, you're talking about apples and oranges, you know, so yes, 1 kilo of apples is 1 kilo, you know, is 1 kilo still, and 1 kilo oranges, yeah, they're both fruit and they're both 1 kilo, but they are still apples, they are still oranges, so they're different, you know, so this ACSF 3 is different to ISLPR 3, is different to IELTS. It asks for different competencies and different things. It kind of, you know, it's a bit like a Venn diagram, you know, so where you've got circles intersecting. So some things actually intersect and some things are just, will never come together, you know, so.
We have to marry them.
You do, and that comes down to how you design your assessment task. You know, so if you're assessing in the, I mean, I've gone a little bit off topic with the questions here, but it's okay. If you're assessing in the AMEP, you really should be using the ATB as much as possible. You know, so I want to emphasize that if you're assessing for the purposes of AMEP, use that Linda Wise task bank, because those assessments are, you know, they may not be perfect, but they're validated to both the curriculum as best as they can be and to the ACSF. And that, as you can see, is not an easy task to do. So, you know, it takes a lot of fiddling around and stuff to actually get that to work. So if you were to do them for just, you know, if you develop your own assessments, which to some extent you have to for the AMEP. I mean, I've got a whole series of exercises on doing that, you know, some which we may not cover today. But if you're doing that for the AMEP, you have to think about it very carefully. Now, if you present your own assessment tasks that are not ATB tasks for the AMEP, the QA auditor is going to scrutinize you more heavily. So you've got to make sure your ducks are in a row. So broadly speaking, yes, it's kind of aligned to the ACSF 3. It's aligned to help you meet some performance features, but to pass this unit of competence doesn't necessarily mean that you're, to drill down exactly, it doesn't necessarily mean that your student has passed this unit will also be guaranteed of passing an ACSF assessment at that level. Likely, yes, but guaranteed, no. So yeah.
More often it's the other way around. We've been slammed by ACSF for exceeding the complexity of the
Yep.
ACSF level.
They love that. Yeah, they love that.
And for things like, oh, you can't include an idiom. People
I know.
at level 3 are not understanding idioms, so take the idiom out of your newspaper article.
I know. Yeah. We've had that in TAFE as well, and unfortunately, that's it's just an unfortunate part of the QA system at the moment and the way that the QA is performed. I mean, I don't want to make this a kind of a, backstabbing session on them, but that's the way that they do the QA. And you run that risk if you don't use an ATB task. If you use an ATB task, they provide far less scrutiny on those tasks. Now, we've had examples of where we've actually had the same task from the ATB and it just didn't have incorrectly. It had a TAFE label on it. It didn't have an ATB, header and footer and stuff. The same task, and it was over scrutinized by the auditor and failed. And we had the same task presented with the ATB badges and stuff on it in a separate audit, it passed. So, unfortunately, that's the world we live in, so, we're stuck with that. And the way around that is to just use ATB tasks. I'll probably cover that in a little bit more sort of depth next week, because they've made recent changes to the ATB. So, I mean, this is something we struggle with in TAFE as well. And it's something that I'm, part of my job is tasked with actually, teaching this to teachers and advising them on how to actually use those tasks, because we're allowed now to use tasks from other curricula, which is, you can't use that as a curriculum assessment, but you can use it as an ACSF assessment. And if you do that and you plan your course well, you can use those other tasks as classroom tasks, pick up your ACSF evidence, pick up your evidence for the PA, and give the students some practice towards your curriculum outcomes. So yeah, that's how I would advise. It's not tricky. It's not easy to do. It's tricky. Yeah.
Darren,
yep.
Fewer assessment. I think maybe because now with the current CSWE, we just need to complete 5 units.
Yes, correct.
Whereas before, I think we had to complete like 7 units.
That's right. And you had as much or more, you had to collect evidence at more points, because then even if you had each module, like they were called modules before and they're units now. So, I mean, they're broadly similar, but before you had to complete 7 modules. So, and in each module you had usually, some of them had 3 learning outcomes, but mostly you had 2 learning outcomes. Now for each learning outcome, you had to assess it twice because you had to collect 2 pieces of evidence. So basically for each module, you had 4 assessments. So in the old course, you had to complete 7 modules. So for most of the courses, apart from the Cert 3, you had to complete 28 assessments. You no longer have to do that. So depending upon the units that you choose, if you've got, say you choose 5 units and each unit has 4 assessments in it, but you've only got to do 5. So in each course, you've only got to do 20 assessments rather than 28, which is what I was saying before. If you calculate the total number of assessments, it is less because the units are bigger. You've got more time to teach the content, more time to teach the skills and knowledge. Even if you've got the same number of assessments per unit, you've still got more time. Usually, I think, the listen and read to the news, read and listen to the news is probably an exception, but you've still got more time to actually teach the skills that you need to. So that's why. And you don't have to assess the same thing 2 times. So, we're not assessing a goods and services transaction twice. we're assessing a goods and services transaction on the one hand, and then a negotiation on the for your second listening assessment. And then in a and that's in this particular unit, which is comprehend and participate in routine formal exchanges. So you've got two different text types. So you're giving them a broader range of skills, but you've got more time within which to teach that. And rolling back up, the question before about the ACSF alignment, when you read these performance criteria, you can see that in many cases, not in every case, but in many cases, they map across to the ACSF. They're analogous to certain performance features in the ACSF at a similar level. So in this case, it would be at an ACSF 3. But, it's not a happy marriage, that one, So, we drew the line at not wanting to rewrite the ACSF as a curriculum. We still going by the ISLPR, and we're still going by the skills that were required in the previous CSWE, and in particular, the text types. So the text types are represented through the unit title and the performance evidence. So we've sort of grouped what were previously separate modules. So you might have had one on discussions before, but now you've actually got it all in one unit, so you would have had to have chosen more than that before.
Another question, Darren?
Yep.
Sorry, I'm still trying to understand the no longer need two pieces of evidence. Do you mean, for example, like in the one I've got here, read and write basic factual text is typical?
Yep.
Okay, so for the reading, it's one unit.
Yes.
So you need to read two different factual texts.
That's right.
And you have to write two different factual
texts. Yes, chosen from that list. That's right. But you don't need to do each of those twice. So in the old CSWE, you would have had to have collected two pieces of evidence for each text type. You don't have to do that anymore. You've just got to do the text type, So you've got to give them a reading assessment for, whatever it is.
Darren, just, I think Jane wants to come back again. Go on.
Yep.
So you give it I was wondering if you can give one test in which you're testing the two texts are in the same test. Or,
sure. You could do that. Yeah, if you design your assessment task so that you've got them reading, you're free to design your assessment. Say you're free from AMEP PAs, okay? So if you're teaching in a context which is not the AMEP, where you have to have ACSF assessments. So if you're just teaching, in your college, and like we do, we run CSWE and TAFE that's not AMEP. So by all means, you could conceive of an assessment whereby you get them to do two different factual tests as part of the one task. For sure, you could do that. So just the way that you conceive of your text, of your assessment. Sorry, your assessment.
Do you want to say more? Okay.
I got a question. Is there gonna be a task bank for CSWE instead of every provider is gonna create the task for themselves?
No, there's not. The short answer to that is no. When AMES got absorbed into TAFE, progressively from about 2015, I think Mandy, my boss, and I sort of tracked the documents, down to sort of between 2015 and 2018. I think I sent something to you, Helen, on that subject. And it just got kind of absorbed into TAFE. Now, AMES used to be funded to do that type of stuff, and TAFE is just another provider like everyone else. So, TAFE has made its own, every provider is answerable to ASQA, so every provider has to have their own suite of assessments that are compliant. So, it's up to every, it's as Helen pointed out in one of the submissions that she's made to the department, that, it's actually cost shifting, so where in the past they used to fund it, they used to fund those things to be developed, and it was sort of looked after by NIAS and so on. That's passed for the AMEP, that is passed to LWA, and it's open to all sorts of things. It's not strictly just CSWE, so you've got some CSWE tasks up there, but it's not it's not just something that's done as a part of servicing people who have CSWE. You used to get it as part of your license. We're not funded for it anymore, and you know, TAFE doesn't have the money to do that.
Okay, one more question, Laurie.
Yep.
So Darren, so
Yep.
you were speaking of the assessment task bank or the ATB.
Yeah.
Does that have tasks for this current CSWE?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So if you're an AMEP provider, you know, they actually encouraging people to use the ATB, and I would encourage you to use the ATB simply because it's easier. You know, I'll talk a bit more about that next week, you know, so using the ATB and how to make the best use of it for CSWE, you know, but you know, your organisation, if you're an AMEP provider, your organisation should have access to it, and you as a teacher should be able to just log into it and pull down a task that suits what you're doing.
So the people who are not AMEP providers don't have access.
No, and unfortunately they're stuck with developing their own assessments. You know, that's yeah.
Yes, there's the story there. So I noticed that it's just after 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
I just want to ask people if that's all right with you, Darren.
Yep.
Could you give Darren some feedback as to what you'd like him to do next week? I know he's got it planned out and we've got an idea, but now we're halfway through.
Yep.
Do you want to just tell Darren anything that you want to have focused on next week, which may or may not be what he has planned? Does anybody want to give him any feedback at all?
Yeah, leave lots of time for questions, and I think if people
Yep.
have questions prompted by today, if
Yep.
they could send them through to
you can send them to me. No, you've all got my emails as a result of me replying to you through Try Booking, haven't you?
Yes. Couldn't get onto it. That's why Sharon posted it.
Yeah, so if we feed questions through to you, if you could leave lots of
Yep.
time next week, that'd be great.
Yeah, look, I was planning to spend a lot of time next week on questions. I didn't get through everything I wanted to today, but that's okay. Some of the questions that you have, and I'll quickly scroll through this. I'll only take 2 minutes to do it, okay? So some of the questions you have relate to the format of the new units, and the questions themselves relate to, like the discussion we just had about evidence, you know, relates also to that format and what's related to evidence. So, you know, I've got a whole heap of things here on how do you plan with CSWE, what those fields are in those. Why I gave you that unit of competence is that I wanted you to actually unpack that, you know, and to go through a whole lot of what sort of things do you consider when you're planning with this new CSWE and the new format, and how to actually pull apart the unit of competence, what each of these things actually really means, how to pull apart the unit of competence and still plan to meet your students' needs and plan to meet your program needs, you know. So, you know, because you've basically got, you know, you've got ASQA requirements, which are the curriculum requirements. So that's all this stuff: performance evidence, knowledge evidence, etc., assessment conditions. But then you've also, if you're in the AMEP, you've also got another layer of compliance over the top of that, which is to do with the ACSF. So I realise that the questions are probably a bit more pithy, you know, so if you don't want me to go through this stuff, I won't. I'll just send it to you. You know, so
maybe send it.
Yeah.
And people can have a look and have, you know, they'll be ahead of the game a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll send it through. You know, this is just, you know, I'll send it to you, and or I'll send it to you, Helen, and you can distribute it to everyone. You know, and then you know, then you can sort of think up stuff for next week. And I'd like to do that activity. So, I mean, I'll send it to you, and please read through it, you know, because I'd like to do that activity that I had planned for today, because that will help answer some of those questions. And if you can pick my brains on how I think about these things, because I've been in this environment for a long time, you know, the last couple of years I've kind of lived and breathed this, you know, this format and this ASQA stuff. I understand it quite well, you know, so, and a lot of this comes down to that, you know, that unit we had to upgrade, we had to do for our upgrade for our TAE, covers this stuff, but this stuff is related to ESOL, to ESL teaching and learning, and our courses, you know, how we must use our courses and what we have to do, you know. So and then I can address all that list of questions that people gave me last week. I think I've addressed some of them now, but I'll address those questions specifically one by one next week, you know, and you can ask me whatever you like. So, you know, that sounds good, Helen. I'll send it out. People can read it. We'll spend half an hour, 3/4 of an hour doing that exercise and unpacking that, talking about it, and then I'll just spend the last 1 hour on questions.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Darren.
I hope it's been helpful. You know, so yeah, I mean, I wish it'd be good to do this in person. We never get enough time to do this stuff. So, you know, but you know, you're just kind of given this stuff now. You're stuck in a vacuum and said, here you go and use it. And, you know, what does it mean? You know, so,
Exactly.
yeah.
So, well, thank you very much, Darren. Do you want to give Darren a round of applause?
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, guys. And I'll see you next week.
A call over the weekend too, Darren.
Sorry, Helen.
I'll give you a call over the weekend.
Oh,